Hi. So my name is JoAnn Wypijewski. I'm a journalist. I'm a friend of Amir's. I was a peace organizer, anti-war organizer, in right after September 11th. I was a co-founder of New York Labor Against the War and U.S. Labor Against the War. But there were a lot of co-founders. Let's say I was among the founding crowd. So I think we should have a discussion here. So I'm not going to ask too many questions, but mostly we'll just have a discussion. But first, I just wanted to ask one question, which Amir said is the question that he's asked most often, which is, why did you make this film? But my question is, why did you begin to make this film in 2006? Because I remember being on that march. I remember all the organizing right after September 11th. I remember the complete letdown after 2003, though we all continued to march. But by 2006, when you started working on this film, it really felt, in New York at least, like the peace movement was dead. And then the soldiers started organizing, and that was very hopeful later. But by 2006, I mean, I was covering the Abu Ghraib trials, and nobody cared. This was the biggest sort of mass atrocity that had made news in the United States and the world about the Iraq War, the torture in Abu Ghraib. And there were many trials. And the first one was full of journalists, tons. The ones that followed had virtually none. I mean, I was covering a number of the first ones for Harper's, all the ones that happened in Fort Hood, Texas, all the ones with the pictures, you know, all those pictures you saw, so those trials. So I covered those. By the end of them, Linda England's, there were really a handful of us, and then a few people flew in just for the final trial, which I covered for Mother Jones, which was the only officer. There were 4 people who were always there. Mother Jones, Reuters, Agence France, and a group from Germany, which I can't remember. So there were other people who flew in and bounced in once in a while. But 2006 really felt like the nadir of everything. And it's so remarkable to me that you began then.
Yeah.
So sorry for the sort of long lead up, but you know, it took him 9 years to make this film.
Yeah.
So what made you think, gosh, in 2006, I'm going to make this film?
Yeah. Well, it's a great question. So I'll pick it up from being on the demo in Berlin on February 15th, which was the biggest demonstration I'd ever been on. And then I came back to London, and there was just enormous excitement, not just amongst my friends, but also lots of people I'd never seen or thought would go on a demo. And that was, firstly, I felt 2 things which gave me a clue. One was, I'm really sorry I missed it in London, and how on earth are all these people excited about going on a demonstration? And that sort of made me think that there's something that's novel that's changed here. It wasn't until 2 or 3 years later, 2006 or so, yeah. Well, 2005, I was in the BBC making a radio program, and I just remember this one afternoon, I just stopped and thought, hang on a minute. It happened in Berlin, it happened in London, where else did it happen? And I literally sat down at a computer and started digging around. And after a few more days and weeks, I realized this thing was enormous and it was international. And then I thought, there's a story here. I was curious, how did it happen? How did the biggest protest in the history of the world happen? It hadn't been told at that stage. Nobody had interrogated it. So, and if you told me at that stage, I would spend the next 9 years making the film, I would have said, you're mad. I didn't know, and it's probably a good thing I didn't know. But anyway, I started digging into it. It took me 4 years. So I was kind of oblivious to the fact that the movement had collapsed and there was nothing going on. I was just curious, and I wanted to tell this story. And it got to a point after a few years where the wanting to tell the story turned into needing to tell the story. So I sort of realized, not that if I didn't tell it, nobody else would, and as it turned out, nobody else did. But it just had to be told. It had to be recorded for posterity. And again, I didn't know it would take 9 years. It took 4 years to develop it, and then some years to raise the money, on and off, and so on. We met, and Wael became a supporter and executive producer on the film. So long story short, I was just needing to tell that story regardless of what had happened to the movement. And the fact that it took so long meant that all sorts of other things fell into my lap. The story of what happened in Egypt and so on only fell into my... I mean, if it had taken as long as the previous films I'd made for the BBC had taken, which would have been anywhere between 6 months and a year, that's one way of making a film. And that's what I used to do. Right. And I didn't expect to spend 9 years making it, but it took what it took, and it had to be made the way it had to be made. And in a way, it was sort of suited, because that's how long these things sometimes take. Maybe not that long, but anyway, it's a long answer to your question.
To my long question. But so in 2006, you weren't aware of what was going on in Egypt?
No, not at all. Only, I mean, I can briefly tell you what happened. I was in America. I started doing the interviews in the States in 2012, and I was at a train station. I think it was in Boston, having interviewed Chomsky going back to New York, and I stopped in a bookshop, and I opened this book called Liberation Square by the man, and I turned to see what he had to say about the Iraq anti-war protests. And there he was saying how critical that day was. And he said that, in fact, the protesters who gathered together on the first day of the war became known as the 20th of March movement. That blew my mind. Wow. And so I thought, I've got to find out about this. So I, found him, contacted him. He put me in touch with all the others, and sure enough, their testimony was that, as you saw, we saw what was going on over there, and we were inspired, and we came out, and we decided, and that movement, the 20th of March movement, became what's known in Egypt as kafaya, which means enough. And all those people and that movement grew into the movement that overthrew Mubarak. So that's how, so I couldn't have known until 2012 what happened in Egypt. And if I had, and I'll just tell you another anecdote, is when I started making the film in 2006, people said to me, "You're late, man. The war is over. What story do you think you're going to tell?"
Well, the war is over, or we've lost. I mean, our war
kind of both. Like the movement's dead, the war is over. What do you think you're making? And I said, well, maybe you're right, and maybe I'm right. They just thought, we didn't stop the war went ahead. There is no story to tell. But I sort of ignored that, and I just thought, the story of the movement and what happened has to be told, regardless of, it's like saying, well, the Titanic sank. What's the point of telling that story? And the war went ahead, but there's still a point to telling the story. And luckily, it taking so long meant that you could tell the full story, the full impact of how long it
So when you end the film with Tony Benn talking about anger and optimism, is that kind of a stand-in for yourself in the making of this film, in a sense?
I think I had never thought about that, and actually you pointing it out is actually it's very interesting. I suppose it is. Yeah, I was sustained maybe by my anger, and by optimism that the film would get finished and would get made. Good, I like that. Yes.
So, would you like to make some comments?
Yeah, thanks, JoAnn. I just wanted to add something. Actually, I think you answered your question. The reason I'm involved with the film is I was on a march, not on that particular day, but in San Francisco the same year, and we thought it was just us, that city and a few other cities around that were demonstrating, because the mainstream media never reported it. So the next day was a Saturday, I remember, and my friends called me and said, "Have you seen the San Francisco Chronicle?" And I said, "No, I never get the papers, news is always the same."
See,
No
this is
offense,
a
but yeah.
problem, yeah.
So they said, "Well, you're on the front page with thousands of other people,
Oh, wow.
and don't worry, we got you a few copies." I'm like, "Great," but we still thought it was just us and a few other cities. And so when Amir started telling me about the film, I was actually really excited, because I was like, there is a story there, because, as we saw in the film, even, parts of the BBC didn't report it. An interesting anecdote is that when Amir asked the BBC for some footage of the largest global demonstration, he got 30 seconds. He said, "Is this part of it?" And they're like, "That's all we have." How can you actually have 30 seconds of something? And sorry about the echo, by the way. For some reason, I'm getting echo here. But yeah, so, so obviously for me, it was very important to have that, film made for many, many reasons. And I think also just, one of the things that fascinated me was that most people to this day don't realize or forget that the fact that millions of people came out was before social, or Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, you name it, TikTok.
No, there were a lot of meetings.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, so for me, there's no reason why we can't have as many people, except that we have lots of distractions, obviously, with all the technology. Also, we didn't really have smartphones back then. So there were so many reasons to be amazed by the amount of people that came out, word of mouth and emails, so.
Yeah. So I think, there are a lot of things that might be talked about, and that so we should just open it up here to your questions for no, I'll pass it around.
And you keep yours, and
yeah, and you for Amir.
Anyone for?
No, I'll pass.
Oh, you're sure?
No,
Okay.
yeah. I like moving around.
No, you mentioned about the sorry. Okay.
It's being streamed.
Okay. All right. So you mentioned the events in Egypt that you became aware of when you were doing research for the film. Was there anything else that happened that really surprised you? That was a revelation for you in researching the film?
Nothing on that scale. I mean, I think there were other things that happened in Tunisia. There was in the town where the man set himself on fire. That turned out to be the same place where there was Tunisia's Arab, kind of Arab Spring. That was sort of what tipped off the Arab Spring. But nothing as big as that. But it's an interesting question, because I fell upon that story because I opened a book in a bookshop so my mind turns to what else did that seed that I just didn't come across, because I was telling this one story of the February 15th movement. Subsequently, and we were talking about this today, I've read that protest in 2003 radicalized and politicized so many people whose stories I then found out. Singers, writers, all sorts of people, including, they did an interview with one of the three women who were the sort of figureheads of Black Lives Matter, Patrisse Cullors, Alicia Garza, Opal Timothée. And one of them said that the first protest she went on, which opened her eyes, was the February 15th, 2003 protest. I just chanced upon that. So, how many other stories like that have happened around the world? It's a good question. I don't know. Somebody, maybe me, should do that job one day.
Yeah, there's a standard line, that people say about protests, which is also what people say about, their love lives. But it's, you always remember your first. And it's often been said that moment of being part of a enormous mass of people, collectively, joyfully, angrily, expressing something with a hope of changing it, really has changed people's kind of whole being. And you hear that again and again and again. Although, well, we can also talk about there's the other question about, okay, you have millions of people, and then you don't, you don't achieve what you hope to achieve. And I thought that comment that one of the people made, which is, what if you'd come back the weekend after, and then the weekend after, and the numbers would have been smaller, and it might not have been the whole world, but it might have been like, I think there was such, in New York, I don't know what other people's experience was, but New York for me was a very disappointing experience because we were just stuck on a street and fighting to get to the stage, and police then sort of attacked us, and we weren't prepared to have a rally right there, which we should have been. We should have had bullhorns. We should have had mini rallies all over, which New York being this grid, we were gridlocked. And it felt very much like this is not a solution to anything. So when you then found out, wow, this is happening everywhere in the world, and people aren't so miserable. We just were in the cold, because it was extraordinarily cold here that day. That gave you this elative sense. I don't know if elative is a word, but.
And one of the other things that the Egyptians learned, and one of them said it, you can't just come out for one Saturday. And, so what they did in Tahrir Square is they occupied it for 18 days. And one of the guys, Ghassan, that I interviewed in the film, he actually said, it's not in the film, but he said, one morning when I went out, I said goodbye to my wife because I didn't think I would get home again that night. There were, I don't know how many people died in Tahrir Square, but quite a few people died. And they were not going to move until Mubarak fell. And now, we know that, after a couple of years, there was a counter-revolution and the military took over. But as Amira said, one day we'll get rid of them too. So, people who went on that demo, who haven't seen the film, understandably will think, well, we protested and it failed, And of course, I don't expect all the world to have seen the film, but there's a perspective that says, we marched, it didn't stop the war. But I think if you take a longer view, there's a different perspective to be had.
Sorry, I'd like to add something to that. I think, one of the things I learned on working on the film is we've been screening it for several years now, and people keep coming up to us and said, we didn't realize not only how massive it was, but that it actually did make a difference. It didn't stop the war that was an imminent war that we couldn't stop, but it kind of stopped other battles and other things. And I think one of the things that became very clear to me is that we live in an instant gratification culture. We want things to change like that. It's not going to happen, And I think activism, you've got lots of ups and downs, and I think that's why what you both talked about, Damon Albarn from Blur saying, if we kept coming back, we never really finished the job. And of course, that's easier said than done because we all have our lives and we go back to our everyday stuff and stuff. But I think that's what, true activism's all about. If we keep coming out and coming and protesting, and it's not just wars, it's, women's rights and abortion rights and LGBTQ and whatever we're passionate about personally, I think it really does make a difference. And I think the powers that be want us to believe that one voice, one person doesn't make a difference, but it does.
So, more questions? Or comments? Right.
Don't be shy. Otherwise,
I thought it was a good history lesson. That's all I want to say.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
It certainly was.
Yeah.
It certainly was. Did you ever think of including any of the Occupy stuff? I mean, I was just thinking about that in terms of Tahrir Square, they stayed. I mean, that was, Occupy didn't have a demand so much as a sort of, it was a kind of performance of we are here.
Yeah, well.
And we are the 99%, and we are pissed off. But
in a version of the film, before the final version of the film, I had about a 5 to 10 minute section which connected the dots from what happened in Cairo to what happened in Athens to what happened in Spain to what happened in New York. And it was literally a domino effect. There were people who were in Cairo who went and talked to the people in Athens, who went and talked to the indignados in Spain, and then I even found one of the Egyptian activists. I found video of him talking to the Occupy group. So there's a direct, I mean, there's a wonderful circularity.
There is, yeah.
The protests in the West triggered the protests in Egypt, which 10 years later flowered into their thing and fed it back through that domino effect. And I had to make a tough decision about what to cut, and I cut that. But yeah, there were some beautiful moments there. Couple there.
So I'm curious, this is somewhat related perhaps to the first question, but less in a factual way of what you discovered. Was there anything that, like any opinion or any belief about the world that you held very dearly, that you were kind of forced to revise through researching this documentary? Like
any belief that I'd had dearly about the world, which I had to.
And is there like still something that you really struggle with, like coming to terms with, like any kind of, you're just kind of running up against the wall of what you believe to be the case in the world? And
that's one of the best questions I've been asked in 7 years since making the film. Excellent. I don't know if I have an answer to that. Probably if I sat down with a drink, I'd have a few thoughts. As realistic as I thought I was about how things work on two levels, both on a sort of activist, sort of political ground roots level and at the kind of higher level, I think certain what do you call it, preconceptions were stripped away about both how dark politics can get, people like Tony Blair, and but also, some disappointments about how, I mean, on some levels, hugely impressed. Who could not be hugely impressed by the kind of level of organization and so on? But also on some other levels, some disappointments about aspects of that, which probably we haven't got time to go into. But I don't know how groundbreaking those observations to me are. But I will say that I think, taking the UK at least, when I talk about the Iraq War and the deaths and so on, in the context of a Labour government that did what it did under Tony Blair, I get told, in not so many words, enough already about Iraq. And that is something I'm still not able to process, because what's really underlying that is we don't so much care about those lives, because look, Tony Blair did, I don't know, he put a kind of preschool program for kids in, and I think we were talking about this.
Sure Start, right?
It's called Sure Start. And so you get a lot of people consider themselves liberal and progressive and so on. And they will say, effectively what they're saying is that one thing kind of outweighs the other, or I think as you put it, absolves the other. And I suppose I'm still shocked, because it tells us, what are, who said it? Some lives are grievable and some lives are not. And I think I thought that that's not where our society was. And I realize that's where our society is, that the lives of those brown people over there are not as grievable. And unfortunately, I have to say, if you now look at how we in the UK and maybe elsewhere have responded to Ukraine. The entire country has opened up its arms to Ukrainians. And you've even had journalists, and I've written about it, saying things that you really didn't think in 2023 you'd hear. Things like, well, gosh, they look just like us. They're blonde and so on. How can this be happening? And it's hard to know how to process that, you know. So that's a very long, you know, post realization, but wasn't at the time. And in a way, that juxtaposition that I've just described couldn't have happened until now.
Thanks. I can't help thinking that at this moment we are walking distance from the United Nations.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if during the course of the filmmaking or other times that subject has been brought up, whether it has been a failure in a sense, a waste. You brought up that let's say the colored peoples of the Southern Hemisphere, Africa, Latin America also have, we haven't heard much about reactions at that time to this conflagration involving Iraq. But coming back to the UN, did the subject of a hope or a thought ever come up that for the future there might be more attention to what used to be an ideal back after 1945 and so on? It was an ideal. Is it totally in the past at this moment?
You mean for me to address the role of the UN, or you're asking just what my opinion is about it?
And that in the course of filmmaking,
Mm-hmm.
was there anyone who invoked that as an image or a possibility, or let's say then in your opinion, how about for the future? How much attention?
Not really, because the story was so much about that, protest. The UN did not sanction it. That was an incontrovertible thing. Kofi Annan, did talk about it. The question of whether it did its job or not, you could actually argue that was one of the few cases where they did do their job, because they didn't sanction it. There was a story in a newspaper in the UK where there was a leak, and I've subsequently interviewed the woman who leaked the story, which was that they discovered that the US was spying, eavesdropping on the members of the Security Council in order to blackmail them into voting and supporting, so that was leaked. And they persuaded quite a lot of them by bribing and threatening and so on, but it still didn't work, and they were never going to get the support of Russia. France was also opposed, and the UK and US did their utmost to throw mud at them. And in the end, when they knew they were not going to get a second resolution, they gave up. And the thing is that if you now listen to what the rest of the world is saying about Russia, Ukraine, this is coming back to haunt them. They probably thought that this was going to be, forgotten about. Nobody cares about the UN. Nobody cares about international law, and that memories are going to be short. Memories are not short outside of the US. Memories are very, very long. And so now everyone is saying, well, you can talk. You were the ones that went to Iraq. If you read all that's the commentary in the UK and pretty much everywhere else in the rest of the world. The UK and US trampled all over international law very, very blatantly, and they thought there was no price to pay. Well, we're paying the price now. So on that point, what is my opinion about the future? It's very problematic. Should the UN Security Council be reformed? Yes, it should. How? I don't know, but at least back then it did do a job.
Except, if I can just weigh in for a minute.
Sure.
If you go to the UN, all the things that are sort of enshrined in that building, and the statues and the words that have been etched into slabs of stone are all about stopping war and beating swords into plowshares. And so the United Nations was really, like you say, this ideal of, we're going to work things out. We're not going to have war again. We're going to figure out an international tribunal and international systems by which negotiation, and there will be no war anymore. We can't do it anymore. So actually they failed then, and they're failing now, because there is war all over the world, and there is a very, very, very dangerous war between essentially NATO and Russia, and the UN seems helpless.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point. Yeah.
I agree. Sorry, I agree with you, but I also agree with Amir that they did do their job. Maybe it wasn't successful, but in that instance, because often you hear about, like, the UN, for example, almost all 15 members, 14 members vote for Palestine, and the US vetoes it every single time. So obviously there needs to be a change. I mean, that's just one example of many, but there needs to be a change in the format, like Amir said. But I think in that instance, and it kind of brings me back to when most people, we've had lots of positive comments on Facebook when we talked about the screening here at the People's Forum and the upcoming one tomorrow at New Plaza Cinema in New York. We had so many positive comments. We had one comment saying, we're past that now. And we actually said, no, we're actually not past that now. What's happening right now in the world. This is why this is so important. I mean, this film, unfortunately, for the world has a very long shelf life. For us, it's as filmmakers, it's not a bad thing. But for the world, and that's why I can see us, screening it for years to come, and universities invite us, and colleges and schools invite us to screen it and have discussions in the classrooms, because as this lady said, it's a historical document, but it's also something that needs to be reminded, and we need to remember that things like what's happening with NATO and Russia and the Ukraine situation, that is definitely relatable to the Iraq War as well.
There's a minor note. It's funny how history works. Now, post-Trump, there's a kind of a George W. Bush rehabilitation program going on. It's like, well, maybe he wasn't so bad after all. Maybe compared to and the same thing is happening with Tony Blair in the UK. So, who knows? Wait another 10 years, and I don't even want to think about where that rehabilitation will end up.
I'm sorry, I didn't. Oh no, but that really, to see this film now, and I saw it before. I saw it last year. I helped run a project in the summer called the Kopkind Colony, or just Kopkind, with John Scagliotti, who's a great documentary filmmaker, and some other people. And Amir was there for our film camp, which we do with Center for Independent Documentary. So I've seen it this second time. But, somehow the parts about George W. Bush in this film, I think because I was busy worrying about other things at the camp when I saw it, just completely enraged me here. And the fact that George W. Bush, yes, is being seen as kind of a noble statesman and Cincinnatus, he went back to his ranch and he's painting and he's working out and he's cutting shrub and he's just,
painting,
removed himself from public life. Well, yeah, he should be on trial at The Hague. And it seems astonishing to me that in this moment where we're talking about the Ukraine and intervention and war and who should be going to The Hague, well, maybe the left should have a sort of standard now, like a basic standard. You invade another country, you go to The Hague. So Putin, George W. Bush, Rumsfeld, Cheney, you know, the people who are Netanyahu, you know, et cetera, and just, you know, don't have it for the special. We don't really care about. There was a lot of discussion in 2001, right after the bombing, you know, the World Trade Center attack, and it really split the left because people were saying, "Oh, international law is bunk." And a bunch of people were saying, wait a minute, we've always been arguing about international law because we've been arguing about self-determination of Palestinians and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And people were going, no, no. And there would be huge fights and meetings that started with thousands of people became meetings of 800, became meetings of 500, became meetings of 100, became meetings of ultimately like 25. And the working groups continued, but the big meetings were insane because people were fighting over tiny, tiny differences. I mean, they were really important, but they, you know, you can say, yeah, international law has been a tool of the United States and the tool of great powers for everyone but themselves. But, you know, you can also insist, yeah, but there is a law, and as we are not society without laws, then there should be equal justice under the law, which sounds so conservative, you know, and it is conservative, actually. It's just not contemporary, what's contemporary conservative. So.
Right. I wanted to also add something. I mean, obviously, George Bush, it's haunting him because, you know, wasn't it just not that long ago that he said Iraq instead of Iran or something like that? Or he got, you know, mixed up. And then obviously in the film we saw, you know, Blair also stuttering when he was talking about, you know, getting rid of Saddam and that, you know, it's he's doing something good for people, you know. So I think it's definitely haunting them. You know, does that make a huge difference? Maybe not, but at least it's on their conscience somehow.
Yeah. One quick thing. Okay. You know, I saw something that Noam Chomsky, it was an old interview, but he said, you will not find one reference in the media in the UK or the US that describes the Iraq war for what it actually is in international law, which is the supreme crime of aggression, which is what Nuremberg declared, you know. And on that score, it's a crime against humanity. It's a you know, it's the crime that supersedes and contains within it all other crimes. You will never hear that, you know, discussed. And what was very funny was. Funny, maybe it's not the right word. Earlier this year, Gordon Brown, the prime minister who succeeded Tony Blair, was out campaigning saying we should bring Putin to trial for war crimes. And it hasn't been, I mean, the war isn't over, and that's been decided. Whereas nothing like that has been said for, and nothing like that will ever be said about Iraq.
Well, let's not say never. Does anyone, before we go to you, does anyone who has not asked a question have a question?
Sorry, I just wanted to add one thing. We're not really good at remembering or good at selling things, but if anyone still has a DVD player and is interested in a DVD, we actually have some for sale, so please come see me afterwards. Thank you.
So we're going to wrap up soon, but do you have an immediate response to something that was just said so that, you sure? No, I would come back to you. I just thought.
No, I was just wondering, when you talk about international law, you know, it's like there's just been such a lack of accountability. You know, it makes it hard. You know, where do you start?
I completely.
Did this guy?
Yeah, I completely agree. There was, I think, there was.
Thank you. Thank you for documenting this popular movement. So following on some of the discussion already, as the rhetoric against China escalates, the film is even more relevant, right? And my question, I suppose, is, I have one for you as well, is what tips, if any, have you gleaned after studying this mass movement for the masses looking ahead, right? Like, what else can we do? How do we apply pressure, increase pressure? I guess one of them would be sustained pressure. What else?
I've been. That's really the question that hangs over this whole thing. For I guess for all social movements, anti-war movements, and so on. Is what are the tools in the toolbox? Where do you go after protests? You know, is it violent revolution at one end, or is it sort of civil disobedience? Is it kind of Gandhi-like? You know, and the thing is, I don't know. I think it's not saying that one should replace protests from the toolbox. It's there, but what are the other things that they can do? You know, and some of the things that people are asking is, what can the left or anti-war people or activist movements learn from the organizations on the right? You know, because they've got some tricks. You know, I'm not saying we emulate them, but there's something to be looked at there. And I don't know. One thing I've noticed over the years, both in making this film and I also co-produced my brother's film, which was about the coup in Iran in 1953, is that the American government or kind of Western governments have a kind of a limited playbook. You know, coups and, you know, interfering in other countries and organizing coups and so on. And so there is something to be studied there. I mean, there is an American academic, I think Francis Fox Piven, and you know, who's written a book, you know, Why Movements Succeed.
Yeah.
You know, and I think it's a really fascinating study. We should probably get into the sort of psychology of these people, like the psychology of people like Bush and Cheney and Rumsfeld and so on, which kind of maybe we don't. I think movements necessarily have to focus on actions on, you know, on the streets and so on. But, you know, wars are started by people. I'm kind of making a film about Tony Blair, and it's fascinating when you get into his head, what's really going on there, and the same with Bush and all these other people. It's a new film. And I don't know whether that teaches us anything or whether we can have any useful things to do as a result of it. But I think that, again, ought to be part of the story. I wish I had an answer. I mean, yes, they're going to want to go to war with China. Who can stop that if they want to do it?
There is a useful thing that is related to this. I think that a really smart organizer and strategist once said about the left and the right, which is that the left considers every win a victory, like major victory, like we've got it now. And the right considers every loss a temporary setback. And so the question of whether you collapse after you've lost or whether you think that what you've won is a permanent victory is really critical, because there are no permanent victories. And I think the right really has been pretty dogged. They have setbacks, they keep going. We have setbacks, we keep going too, but I think as a movement, the left has had these spectacular moments, and when they're crushed or when they don't come to fruition, then there is what Bill Fletcher said, another really smart organizer said, morale just dropped. And naturally it would, but the question is, what do you do the next day? You know, your morale drops when your life screws up and you have to keep going. And this afternoon, we had a long talk this afternoon about many, many things, and Amir brought up a quote, which I think is really useful to keep in mind, because it doesn't answer your question, which is kind of unanswerable, except to say, those who love peace must learn to organize as effectively as those who love war.
I think it was Dr. King.
And it was Dr. King.
It was Dr. King?
Yeah, it was. And I'm not sure what book it was in or what speech it was in, but the idea of organizing effectively for peace and organizing effectively for war. I mean, it is true that the warmongers organize very effectively. And, you know, when all those people in the film are saying you keep going and you keep going, well, it's hard for the same people to keep going, but new people you can bring in, new people who are going to have more energy, and then onward and onward. And I mean, I think we have had a lot of victories, and we have to recognize those. And the film is a wonderful testament to that. But the losses are also painful. Mm-hmm. And if we can think about them as setbacks, and think about organizing for peace, not just when the war is imminent, not just when you think the countdown is happening, but as soon as the drums start beating, as soon as this kind of mood of belligerence starts filtering through the air and through the media and through the social media and through everything, when people accommodate themselves to the idea that horror is maybe the cost is okay. Clearly, people used to say, oh, you can't, it's going to cost too much. No, it doesn't matter what it costs. $6 trillion. All these people who talk about the budget and, we have to worry about, no, they had $6 trillion to prosecute these wars. They have the money to do what they want. And we always have to organize to get what we want. And I think that's the only way to think about it. It's existential. It's about your life, and then it's about what you do tomorrow and the next day, and what the next generation does, and what you can do today for the next generation to come forward, which is the ultimate thank you for this film, because this film educates people who were not there and people who who are not even born. So thank you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for making this wonderful film.
Thank you.